Hi, I'm Freya Hickman, the founder of Remind. Remind is on a mission to empower trauma survivors to rebuild their lives. We're currently developing a mobile app to provide individualised mental wellbeing support. In the UK, 1 in 2 of us will experience a traumatic event in our lifetime. The 2014 Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey showed that 4 in 100 of us will be experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder at any given point in time. But according to the leading charity PTSD UK, approximately 3 out of those 4 won't receive any professional mental health support. Trauma is still widely misunderstood in society, and many delay seeking help due to not understanding what they're experiencing as trauma, or because of perceived stigma and discrimination surrounding trauma. Meanwhile, their mental well-being often deteriorates. Existing trauma support is also very limited and difficult to access. There are long waiting lists on the NHS for support. This is not always trauma-focused, and sessions are often very limited. Charity support is less well known and has to be sought out. Fees for private therapy can be very expensive and unaffordable, especially over a sustained period of time. Unmanaged trauma increases risk of re-traumatisation, re-victimisation, and serious complications such as comorbidities and substance abuse, and higher risk of suicide. People who are most likely to experience trauma are also those who are the least likely to be able to access support. Today, I want to talk to you about trauma, the impact on the lives of those who are living with it, and the hope for recovery. I'm going to draw on the perspectives of lived experience, being a survivor myself, and from the many conversations I've had with other survivors of trauma, and from what we know happens from a scientific perspective based on academic research. I believe it's really important to have these conversations so anyone who has experienced trauma or thinks that they may have can understand a little more about what is happening to them and find hope for recovery, and to help break down the misconceptions and stigma about trauma in society. When the word trauma is mentioned, the stereotypical image that springs to mind is one of a soldier who faced untold horrors in combat and comes home different to how he left, with what they used to call shell shock. Whilst it's definitely true that trauma can be caused by being a soldier in combat, we now also know that there are very many other experiences that are traumatic and can result in trauma. Trauma is an emotional response to an event or series of events that are deeply distressing, stressful, or frightening, or threaten or cause physical or emotional harm to you or someone else. Some of these are single events, such as a traumatic birth, a road traffic accident, a terrorist attack, sudden death of a loved one, bereavement by suicide, or experiencing serious health problems. Traumatic experiences can also be repeated events over a prolonged period of time. Examples of these types of experiences include emotional abuse, physical or sexual abuse, and domestic violence. Traumatic experiences can also be a series of multiple events, witnessing harm to somebody else or exposure to traumatic events through work, living in a traumatic atmosphere, or being affected by trauma in a family or community setting. Nobody is immune from experiencing traumatic events, and they can happen at any point in our lives, in childhood, adulthood, or both. In the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, many people will experience acute traumatic stress as a result, but often, and for most people, these symptoms will fade on their own after a few days or weeks. However, for some, the symptoms persist, and approximately 1 in 10 of us will go on to develop PTSD. We don't know exactly why some people develop trauma and others don't, but we do recognise that there are factors which may make it more likely. These include how much support you received at the time of the incident, your relationships and the emotional support system you have around you, and whether or not anything else stressful is happening in your life at that point in time. It's common that someone who has experienced a traumatic event may not recognise their experience as such, or may not feel they are able to, or that it's valid to call it traumatic, compared to the experience of someone else. It's also common that they may not relate to the symptoms that they start to have with their traumatic experience. Sometimes people can be affected by a traumatic event straight away, and other times it may take years before people start to experience symptoms. This is called delayed onset trauma. Even if their symptoms do start soon after the incident, it may be years before some people identify their symptoms. Traumatic stress affects people in different ways, so no two people will experience it in exactly the same way, even if they have very similar experiences. When a traumatic event happens, it's natural to experience what you may have heard called the fight or flight response. When this happens, your body's natural defense systems kick in and your nervous system is flooded with adrenaline, and the limbic system in your brain takes over control of the body to keep you alive. This means that the event does not get processed in the same way a normal memory of a non-traumatic event would be. This can affect if and how survivors remember the trauma and how fragments of memory might come back to them later. The levels of stress hormone may also stay high long after the event has actually finished. Trauma is held in the body. As Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the thought leaders on trauma, aptly named his book, "The Body Keeps the Score." There is another theory called the theory of shattered assumptions, written by Ronnie Jan Hofbellman, which explains trauma through a slightly different lens, based on how people view the world. The theory says most people hold 3 fundamental beliefs, although they may not be articulated. Firstly, that the world, including the people and the things that happen in it, are good. Secondly, that the things that happen in the world have meaning. And thirdly, that we are generally good, capable individuals. During a traumatic event, these fundamental beliefs about yourself, your relationships with others, and your views on the world around you may be shattered, leaving the world around you feeling very unsafe and to the symptoms of PTSD. I like this explanation because life changes when you go through a traumatic event, and it feels like there is a before and after. The concepts of the body keeping the score and the theory of shattered assumptions both really resonate with me personally and in the work that I've done with trauma survivors since. Trauma survivors face a variety of symptoms on a regular basis. To get an official diagnosis of PTSD, these symptoms fall into 4 main categories, and you must be experiencing a certain number of each type of symptom. These are reliving the traumatic event, perhaps in the form of flashback, nightmares, or intrusive memories, avoiding people, places, or situations that are reminders of the event, experiencing negative changes in beliefs and feelings, and feeling hypervigilant or fearful of people and the world around you. Difficulty with sleep or experiencing nightmares is also very common. The diagnosis for complex PTSD, also known as CPTSD, is similar, but with additional symptoms relating to self-worth, emotional regulation, relationships, and suicidal feelings. You may still be struggling with trauma even if you don't have an official diagnosis. Trauma can be comorbid with a variety of mental health conditions, including anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. Trauma survivors often experience physical symptoms or physical health problems too. The additional stress in the body means that they may be at higher risk of conditions such as autoimmune disease, or even cancer. The symptoms of trauma can be completely debilitating and have a huge impact on daily life. Survivors are often dealing with several symptoms at the same time and frequently throughout the day. Symptoms can be brought on very suddenly by events called triggers, which are external to the survivor, such as loud noises, crowded places, or something someone says. Like the symptoms that people experience, triggers are unique to the individual. A trigger commonly causes a flashback. Flashbacks are where the survivor is reliving part or all of the experience, as though it's happening in the present moment, and it feels completely real. It can bring back memories, images, sounds, movements, and emotions. Research studies using brain imaging have shown that when trauma survivors relive their traumatic experience through a flashback, their brain reacts in the same way that it would have during the original event, which is why to a survivor it can feel like their body reacts before their mind can catch up with what is happening in the here and now, as the mind and body struggle to distinguish between past and present. Studies have also shown that survivors' brains have been physically changed by trauma. Due to the debilitating nature of trauma symptoms, such as a panic attack or a flashback, and the fact that they can be triggered at any time, even during seemingly routine activities, like the daily commute when suddenly caught up in a crowd, or out for a drink with friends and a glass smashes behind the bar, it can make both the triggers and the symptoms more scary, and survivors can become fearful not only of the world around them, but also of their symptoms too. It's completely exhausting to feel like every day is a battle to go through because you don't know what will happen when, and there might not be much respite at night when you sleep due to insomnia or nightmares, leaving you feeling anxious before the next day has even started. Sometimes people say things to a survivor like, "Get over it," or "Aren't you over that yet?" But because of the way that trauma is held in the body reacts to the triggers. And if new triggers or symptoms pop up, even years later, it can take a long time to heal from trauma. It's not that the person doesn't want to let go. Trust me, they would if they could. But the body is literally keeping the score. The good news is that with the appropriate care, knowledge and support, survivors can heal from and transform trauma to rebuild their lives. Judith Herman identifies a model of recovery in her work that shows a 3-stage recovery process. The first stage is for the survivor to be able to establish psychological and physical safety so they feel safe in both body and mind. The second stage is remembering and mourning, where the survivor can process what happened to them and grieve. The final stage is reconnecting with others and the world around them. Of course, it's not likely that recovery will be linear, and it will take different amounts of time for each individual. It's so important that trauma survivors can get the mental wellbeing help and support that they so desperately need in a timely manner so that they can start to heal, take care of their mental wellbeing and rebuild their life. It's why I started Remind. It's also important that we speak more about trauma, what it's really like to live with on a day-to-day basis, and what is happening in the body, so that as a society we can be more understanding so that survivors no longer have to add stigma to the list of challenges that they are already facing. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Becky for inviting me to speak today. If you would like to get in touch or find out more about Remind, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. My details are in my biography. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.